Darth Vader stood at the edge of the shattered battlefield, the frigid wind cutting through the silence like a phantom whisper. Snow blanketed the landscape, muffling the sounds of his respirator. Each breath was a harsh, mechanical reminder of what he had become. The scene before him was hauntingly desolate, a graveyard of forgotten lives and abandoned causes. The wreckage of the Venator-class Star Destroyer loomed in the distance, its skeletal remains jutting out of the frozen wasteland. His boots crunched against the snow as he approached the remnants of the battlefield, the echoes of long-forgotten battles clawing at the edges of his mind. It was there, amidst the quiet devastation, that he found them. The lightsabers rested on the icy ground, half buried beneath layers of frost and ash. Their silver hilts gleamed faintly in the waning light, untouched by time but burdened with the weight of memories. Vader's steps faltered for a fraction of a moment as he gazed down at them. His breath caught in his chest, not from exertion, for his cybernetic body was tireless, but from something deeper, something more primal: recognition. The weapons were unmistakable. Ahsoka Tano's lightsabers. The name carved through his consciousness like a blade. Ahsoka, the Togruta girl who had been his Padawan, his companion, and at times his equal in ways even Obi-Wan had not been. Ahsoka had stood by his side in the darkest hours of the Clone Wars, a beacon of loyalty and fire. She had challenged him, questioned him, and in doing so, had earned a respect he rarely offered freely. She had been family. But family, he reminded himself, was a concept belonging to a man who no longer existed. Anakin Skywalker had been her teacher. Darth Vader had no students. He knelt, the servos in his legs whining softly as he reached out with his gloved hand. The moment his fingers brushed the hilt of the larger saber, a cascade of memories flooded his mind, unbidden and merciless. He saw Ahsoka as she had been young, brash, and endlessly determined. He remembered the first time she had ignited her lightsaber, her face lit with a mixture of awe and determination. She had been so proud, so eager to prove herself. Her laughter echoed in his mind, a phantom sound from a life that felt like a dream. And then there was the betrayal, or what he had seen as betrayal at the time. Her departure from the Jedi Order. Anakin had begged her to stay, had told her that they could fight the injustice together, that they were stronger as a team. But she had walked away, leaving him behind in a sea of unanswered questions and simmering resentment. That wound had festered, a bitter seed that had grown alongside his burgeoning doubts about the Jedi and their hypocritical dogma. As Vader lifted the lightsaber, his grip tightened unconsciously. The weapon was a relic of another era, a tool of the Jedi. Yet it felt alive in his hand, humming faintly with the echoes of its former master. He ignited the blade, the blue light casting an otherworldly glow against the snow. The color was jarring, almost offensive to him now. It was a Jedi's blade, a symbol of everything he had destroyed and everything he had once sworn to protect. The contrast was a cruel reminder of the duality within him, the eternal war between the man he had been and the monster he had become. The second lightsaber lay nearby, smaller and sleeker. He reached for it, hesitating for the briefest of moments before his fingers closed around the hilt. This one felt different. It was lighter, more refined, a reflection of Ahsoka's growth and adaptability as a duelist. He ignited it as well, the shorter blade coming to life with a soft hum. The green glow mingled with the blue, a swirl of colors that should have evoked warmth and peace. Instead, it felt like an accusation. Why had she left? The question burned in his mind, as raw and unanswered as it had been the day she walked away. Anakin Skywalker had blamed himself. He had told himself that if he had been a better teacher, a better friend, she might have stayed. He had seen her departure as a failure, not just of the Jedi Order, but of himself. But Darth Vader saw it differently. The Sith in him whispered that she had been weak, that she had lacked the resolve to endure the trials of the Jedi. She had abandoned him when he needed her most. And yet, even as Vader tried to bury the ache beneath layers of anger and cold logic, the memories persisted. He remembered the last time he had seen her before his fall. She had been strong, defiant, and more certain of her path than he had ever been of his own. Her independence had been both her greatest strength and her greatest flaw. Anakin had admired it, even envied it at times. But now, as Vader, he could not help but view it as another betrayal. She had left him alone in a galaxy that seemed to crumble around him, a galaxy that had taken Padme, his mother, and everyone he had ever cared for. The Sith thrived on abandonment and despair, and Ahsoka's absence had only deepened the chasm within him. He extinguished the blades and stared at the hilts in his hands. The snow continued to fall around him, the silence broken only by the faint hum of his respirator. He knew what the lightsabers represented. They were more than weapons, they were extensions of Ahsoka herself, her strength, her determination, and her unwavering belief in what was right. Even now, long after she had disappeared from his life, they spoke of her unyielding spirit. For a moment, he considered destroying them. A flick of his wrist, a surge of the Force, and the lightsabers would be no more than fragments of metal and crystal scattered across the snow. It would be easy, satisfying even, to erase this reminder of his past. Yet, as he held them, he found himself unable to follow through. To destroy these lightsabers would be to destroy the last tangible connection to Ahsoka, to Anakin Skywalker, to everything he had lost. And while Vader had dedicated himself to obliterating the remnants of his former life, there was a part of him buried deep beneath layers of hatred and regret that could not let go entirely. Instead, he rose to his feet, the lightsaber still clutched in his hands. He turned his gaze to the horizon, where the wreckage of the Star Destroyer loomed like a monument to failure. This battlefield was a graveyard of the past, a place where the Republic and the Jedi had died. Yet, in the midst of this ruin, these lightsabers endured, defiant against time and decay. It was almost ironic. Ahsoka's blades had outlasted the order she had left behind, the war she had fought in, and the master she had once followed. Vader's thoughts turned inward, spiraling through the labyrinth of his memories. He wondered if Ahsoka was still alive, if she had survived the purges and the rise of the Empire. The thought was both comforting and infuriating. If she lived, it meant that some part of the old galaxy still existed, a fragment of the idealism he had abandoned. But it also meant that she had escaped him, that she had found a way to defy his will, as she always had. He had heard whispers, of course. Rumors of a Togruta warrior who had aided the fledgling rebellion, of a shadowy figure who fought against the Empire with a ferocity that rivaled the Sith themselves. But Vader had dismissed them as stories, fabrications of desperate rebels clinging to false hope. And yet, as he stared at the lightsabers, he could not shake the feeling that Ahsoka was out there, somewhere, continuing to fight in a galaxy that had grown darker with every passing day. Vader clenched his fists, the metal of his gauntlets creaking under the pressure. The lightsabers were a reminder of everything he had failed to protect and everything he had chosen to destroy. They were a symbol of the choices that had led him to this moment, standing alone in the cold, a shadow of the man he had once been. For all his power, for all the fear he inspired across the galaxy, he could not escape the weight of his own past. He turned away from the wreckage, the lightsabers still in his grasp. The snow swirled around him as he made his way back to his shuttle, the wind howling like a mournful dirge. The lightsabers would not be destroyed, not yet. They would remain with him, a silent testament to the life he had lost and the apprentice he had failed. Perhaps, in some way, they would remind him of the lessons he had once tried to teach, lessons he had since cast aside in his pursuit of power. As the shuttle's ramp closed behind him, Vader stood in the dim light of the cargo hold, staring down at the lightsabers one last time. Ahsoka's voice echoed in his mind, soft and distant, a fragment of a memory long buried. For a moment, he allowed himself to wonder what she would think if she saw him now, if she would recognize the man beneath the mask. But the moment passed quickly, and he pushed the thought away. It did not matter. Nothing mattered now except the will of the Emperor and the power of the dark side. Yet, as the shuttle ascended into the sky, carrying him away from the frozen battlefield, the lightsabers remained. The shuttle ascended into the darkened skies, the hum of its engines blending with the ever-present rhythm of Vader's mechanical breathing. He stood motionless in the cargo hold, the two lightsabers still cradled in his gloved hands. Their cold metal hilts seemed to pulse faintly, as if they were alive, as if they carried within them the echoes of their wielder's spirit. Vader's gaze lingered on them, his thoughts an uneasy swirl of anger, regret, and something he could not name, something dangerously close to grief. Grief was not an emotion Darth Vader allowed himself to feel. It was a weakness, a crack in the armor he had so meticulously built around himself. The Sith thrived on anger, on hatred, on the consuming fire of power. But grief, that belonged to the man he had killed, the man who had once been Anakin Skywalker. And yet, holding these lightsabers, he felt the edges of that forbidden emotion creeping into his consciousness. They were a relic of the past, yes, but also a reminder of the fragility of the life he had left behind. He turned away sharply, his cape swirling behind him as he strode toward the cockpit. The lightsabers were clipped to his belt now, their weight unfamiliar yet not unwelcome. As he entered the cockpit, the pilot droid straightened and awaited his command. "Set course for Coruscant," Vader ordered, his voice a deep, resonant growl. The droid complied without question, the shuttle veering toward the distant jewel of the Empire. Coruscant was no longer the shining center of the galaxy it had been during the Republic. Under Imperial rule, it had become darker, colder, a reflection of the man who now ruled it. Vader welcomed its shadowy spires, its endless cityscape suffused with the oppressive weight of the Empire's dominion. As the shuttle leapt into hyperspace, Vader stood silent, his mind far from the stars streaking past the viewport. The lightsabers at his side were a constant presence, a reminder that he could not escape his past, no matter how deeply he buried it. Ahsoka had been a part of that past, a part he had tried to sever along with everything else that had tethered him to the Jedi. Yet, even in her absence, she remained. Her memory was like a wound that refused to heal, raw and unrelenting. He thought back to the Clone Wars, to the countless battles they had fought side by side. Ahsoka had been more than just a student. She had been a partner, someone he could rely on in a galaxy filled with treachery and uncertainty. She had challenged him, argued with him, even defied him when she believed he was wrong. And she had been right more often than he cared to admit. Anakin had been proud of her, even when her stubbornness infuriated him. She had reminded him of himself in so many ways, and that connection had been both comforting and unsettling. But Vader was not Anakin Skywalker anymore. The man who had taken Ahsoka as his apprentice had been weak, blinded by his own emotions and his faith in a flawed order. Vader had destroyed that man, just as he had destroyed the Jedi and the Republic they served. And yet, he could not destroy the memory of her. It clung to him like a shadow, slipping through the cracks in his armor, no matter how tightly he tried to seal them. The shuttle emerged from hyperspace, and the sprawling skyline of Coruscant came into view. Vader's mind snapped back to the present as the droid guided the shuttle toward the Imperial Palace. The cityscape below was a labyrinth of lights and shadows, a stark contrast to the snow-covered battlefield where he had found the lightsabers. This was his domain now, a world shaped by his will and the will of the Emperor. It was a world without Ahsoka, without the Jedi, without the burdens of the past. Or so he told himself. The shuttle landed smoothly, and Vader descended the ramp without hesitation. Imperial officers and stormtroopers snapped to attention as he passed, their fear and reverence palpable. He paid them no mind. They were tools, nothing more. His focus was on the lightsabers, their presence a weight he could not ignore. He carried them to his private chambers, a stark and oppressive space that mirrored the emptiness within him. Once inside, he placed the lightsabers on a sleek black table, their silver hilts gleaming under the dim lights. He stood over them, his hands resting on the table's edge as he stared down at the weapons. Memories continued to assault him, unrelenting in their vividness. He saw Ahsoka's face as she had been when he first met her, a young and eager Padawan desperate to prove herself. He saw her as she had been during the siege of Mandalore, a seasoned warrior who had grown into her own strength. And he saw her walking away from the Jedi Temple, her silhouette receding into the distance as Anakin called out to her, his voice tinged with desperation. Vader clenched his fists, the metal of his gauntlets digging into the table's surface. The emotions swirling within him were a maelstrom of conflicting impulses. He wanted to crush the lightsabers, to shatter them and erase the reminders of her existence. But he also wanted to keep them, to hold onto the last piece of someone who had meant so much to him. The duality was maddening, a stark reminder of the man he had been and the monster he had become. He reached out with the Force, his presence a dark and oppressive tide that filled the room. The lightsabers lifted from the table, hovering in the air before him. He closed his eyes, focusing on the energy within them, the kyber crystals that had once resonated with Ahsoka's connection to the Force. They were quiet now, their light dimmed by her absence, but they still carried traces of her, faint and fleeting, like echoes in a cavern. He probed deeper, searching for something he could not name. Perhaps he was searching for her, for a sign that she was still alive, that she had not been claimed by the galaxy's relentless tide of death and destruction. Or perhaps he was searching for himself, for the remnants of the man who had once been her master. What he found instead was a void, an emptiness that mirrored the one within him. The lightsabers offered no answers, only questions he could not escape. The silence in the room was oppressive, broken only by the soft hum of the lightsabers as they hovered in the air. Vader opened his eyes, his gaze fixed on the weapons. He thought of Ahsoka again, of the bond they had shared and the trust they had placed in each other. It was a bond that had been shattered, first by her departure and then by his fall. He wondered if she had felt it, the moment he had turned to the dark side. Had she sensed the death of Anakin Skywalker? Had she mourned him, or had she simply moved on, leaving him behind as she always had? The thought was bitter, but Vader embraced it. Bitterness was easier than grief, easier than the pain of remembering what he had lost. He extinguished the lightsabers with a flick of his wrist, their hum fading into silence. He placed them back on the table, his movements deliberate and precise. They would remain here, a silent reminder of a life that no longer existed. As Vader turned and walked away, his cape trailing behind him, he felt the weight of the lightsabers lingering in his mind. They were more than relics, they were symbols of a connection he could never truly sever. And no matter how much he tried to bury the past, it would always find a way to resurface. For now, he pushed those thoughts aside. There was work to be done, battles to be fought, and enemies to be crushed. The galaxy would not wait for his introspection. But even as he descended deeper into the darkness of his own making, the lightsabers remained a flicker of light in the shadow, a ghost of the man he had once been, and a reminder of the apprentice he had lost.